So the corpus, the whole corpus of Maven Central is published. So Chris, we have every single Gitoid of every single jar, file within jar published. There was an indexing error where I was not properly indexing from source files to class files, but I fixed that. It's in the process of doing the re-indexing. The new index should be up in about 2 hours. And there's a full curl interface to it. And Chris, if you want to check out the Slack channel, there are a bunch of Slack examples. It plays exceedingly well with Andrew's omnibor-rs stuff, because with the omnibor ID command from the executable, you can do a curl, HTTPS goatrodeo/omnibor $, open omnibor ID by file, and it's going to give you all the information about the file that you're IDing. There's also a bulk lookup, which basically does an automatic northbound traversal. So it's, if you say, here's a file, for example, a source file or a class file, you can say what jars and what packages does the jar contain, or transitively contains the file. And there's also a Perl lookup. So you can basically say, here's my Perl, give me all of the Gitoids that reference this Perl. And also current CVE information from osv.dev is embedded with the responses.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's amazing.
So it's basically about 1 terabyte of indexing data. And my next stop is going to be some combination of Python or .NET or RPM or Deb. And if anybody has any like burning stuff that they want a corpus of Gitoids on, register your vote and we'll be doing the right thing. There's also a tool that I built where you can point it at a jar file. And because a lot of jar files contain, basically fragments of other jar files. In other words, they're dependencies or WAR files for people who are doing web applications. You can do an analysis of it and it'll tell you what's contained in it and what are the known CVEs of what's contained in it.
So one quick thought that occurred to me, if you're going to go look at .NET, you might want to reach out to Jamie McGee, who did some .NET related work for OmniBOR as well.
Okay. That sounds great. I will ping Jamie, or and if you, is Jamie on the Slack channel, or?
I don't remember, he might be. I do remember that he did some stuff there. Frederick may remember better.
Or which particular, was this for .NET?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't recall hearing anything coming out of that just yet. So I think we should re-engage.
Cool. And now that I have, so the building of the index takes about 6 days for the for the roughly 20 million packages sitting on Maven Central.
Wow.
But if you think about it, 6 days is nothing.
Yeah.
And with this corpus, and by the way, I haven't figured out exactly what the licensing is, but it's going to be Creative Commons, share and share alike or something like that. It's going to be a very permissive license.
If you'd like some advice on that, I'm happy to connect you to Mike Dolan at the Linux Foundation, who has a great deal of wisdom in that area.
Would love that, Ed. I'd appreciate it. And Andrew and I on the Slack channel also discussed pointing corpus.omnibor.io and corpus.omnibor.dev at the corpus. So anybody who's got DNS ability
I don't own this zone, but I can definitely do some DNS.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm sure that can be arranged. It is highly probable that I probably still own the domains. I don't have any great love of owning domains, but I do have a fast trigger figure on registering them. So
We have the
there
same
was at least-
problem.
It's an
If,
expensive habit, I must say.
Mhm.
The worst case scenario, I do own the zt.dev domain and can point something from that as well if you need something short and sweet.
Yeah, so
That's amazing. How did you get that?
I paid a lot of money for
I
it.
was about to say, okay.
I also got it right when the dev became available,
Brilliant.
and it cost me $720 a year to keep it. It never goes down. Yeah.
All right.
It's made more than its money worth for me in value though, so I'm not unhappy.
yeah,
Awesome.
Well, actually, I think that does bring up a point, not for this meeting, but maybe to put on a future agenda, which is as there are kind of semi-commercial, semi-sharing things that come up in omnibor land, how do we deal with the governance? And I think that leads into the broader governance of the project issue. And so I think all of that stuff I'd really love to get that nailed maybe in the next month or two.
I think there is definitely, I think we got to the point where we kind of need to go find a happy home with some foundation or other. And I know there's been some background discussion on that. And I've actually, there are a couple of places we might go to, and I've had some conversations in the background with some of them. I'd like to, there's one thing I'm still trying to figure out how to deal with though. And that is, and input would be welcome, which is that I think we have a lot of very interested parties who probably want to be party to that conversation. And my normal default is to default open, but having sort of frank conversations about the pros and cons of different foundations that we might go to might be a bit much for a publicly recorded call.
Yeah, that was Ava's recommendation in the last call, which Ava was able to attend last week, was to not have that discussion during the open recorded calls.
But I do want to make sure that we collect the active participants who would like to be part of that discussion. Because I do want to make sure that we're sort of open about who can participate. It's just inevitably that conversation is going to involve some frank discussions about pros and cons that, like, we don't want to be unfriendly towards anybody in all of this.
Yeah.
So I guess if folks could like start a name, you want to just, we could start a list of who'd like to be involved in the meeting minutes and people are going to add themselves. Do we have a good place for that?
Perhaps under just active discussions, we've had an existing item, which I think is down here all the way at the bottom. That here we go.
More towards the top.
Yeah, so I'm gonna move it.
Yeah. So because I do like I've for at least one of the places we might want to go, I've literally got an active, hey, we'd love to have a conversation with the relevant people in OmniBOR pointer out that I'd like to pull together and sort of get that going. But it's not quite like security things, but it's kind of in a similar vein. And like I said, I have a real strong propensity to default open, but you can't for everything. And the classic example of that is always the security example, because
your name.
And by the way, my computer froze. Wayland is a problem for me. So if somebody could add my name here, I would appreciate it.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
there's this great technology called X11. Well, it's not there.
I mean, is it great?
Well,
we can either bike shed where we're going to take the where we're going to take OmniBOR, or we could bike shed Wayland versus X11.
Yeah, I think where we're going to take OmniBOR will take much less time.
Well, fingers crossed on that one.
Well, especially since I have heretical opinions, like I used to be a big proponent of a technology called NX from No Machine. basically took X Windows and asynced everything the hell out of it and gave you something that was actually highly performant across multi-100 millisecond latencies.
Wow.
It was
If you can
bullshit.
see my background and the next machine, I am very biased towards display PostScript and the whole next step thing. But that's just me.
Oh man, I ripped my first CD to a Next.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Yeah.
Mine was just a regular home built PC.
So it seems like we have some people here. If anyone else wants to put their name in, this is where to do it. I do think probably good to jump back to this. David, was there anything more to say on the Corpus stuff?
So the next step with the Corpus and with Goat Rodeo, which is the open source stuff that both creates and accesses it, is to be able to point it at Artifactory and other artifact repositories to basically inventory what's in them.
Yeah.
Would love to get some thoughts from people on what beyond Artifactory, what other artifact repository systems are commonly used so that we can start inventorying. And I think it'd be the other thing that I'm looking for is what kind of output would be valuable for people. In other words, you pointed at Artifactory, great, we're going to give you a list of what. And I realize that this is outside of the scope of pure Omnibor, but I'm trying to do stuff that really show. Let me step back for a minute. We have not gotten the uptake from the tools vendors that we've wanted, and I think that's because we don't have good use cases to create the demand. I'm trying to create use cases that generate the demand, so people go, well, it's all nice and good that I can put this in Artifactory, but I actually want it to be output from my build tools and attested to.
No, this is all pure goodness. This is all pure goodness.
So I'm sorry for polluting a little bit of these calls with what do people want to see, but what do people want to see?
No, this is really good.
No, I don't see that as polluting these calls at all. Right? Like
Okay.
the only thing you said that I object strenuously to is the statement that you feel like this is polluting these calls. That I am absolutely wholly opposed to.
Okay, so even my Wayland comments aren't you're not opposed to those, but okay.
No, it's a little bike shitting among friends.
So we should I forget the last name. There's a person named Cairo who now works with me, and he has been integrating a project called RS Tough, or Repository Services for Tough, into a variety of different upstream package managers. The two big ones that he's been working on recently is RS Tough and it's part of the update framework for PyPy and Python, and also for Ruby gems. So one option that we may have is to see whether there's a good story around OmniBOR integration with RS Tough. And if there is, then is there a good integration that could tie in with with at least one of those big repositories, and see if that's possibly an entry.
Sounds good.
So one thing building just related to this that I figured might be nice to show, because there was a mention of the omnibor ID command. This is a relatively new thing in the Rust implementation. I feel like I could just do a quick demo of. It's kind of fun.
Oh, that would be lovely. I would very much like to see that.
Yeah.
If I make this bigger, is this visible, my shell session, or is that
We're
not showing
only
up?
seeing your browser currently.
Yeah.
Okay, let me fix the sharing then. Just a moment. I'll just share the whole screen. And I have bumped up the font size substantially. Okay, so this is just in a code space and just like the latest from the repo. And I think I'm pretty sure I've already done a relatively recent install. So basically there's now a little OmniBOR CLI that's included. And currently it has sort of two meaningful commands. It has ID and it has find. So OmniBOR ID, basically, if you give it a file, it prints the artifact ID. If you give it a directory, it'll recurse through the directory and print artifact IDs for everything that it finds. So, if I do omnibor ID cargo.toml. It just prints this, the file name, and then this little arrow, and then the artifact ID of that. There's some little bit of nicety here. So David actually added the short flag. So if you want just the artifact ID, you can do that.
Nice.
You can also do JSON, where it just has an ID. It gives you an object with an ID and a path. So it's the same data, just in JSON for things that want to consume that.
I'm super happy about both of this, because my very first thought when seeing the cargo.toml with the arrow that you had there, because I'm an old shell hand, was that's tricky to teach awk about.
Sure.
You have the short flag, who cares?
And we could change the other, like the plain format can change too.
No. It's more readable for humans, and the fact that you have the short flag means you don't care, right? Because all you'd be using awk for would be to effectively pull apart the cargo toml and the getaway blob piece, and between JSON and short, you're better off with those.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. And then for a directory, here I'll do the omnibor create itself. Some line breaking stuff, kind of annoying here, but it just does all of the files that it recurses down, and you get all of the hashes for that. I'm going to copy one of these because the other command, clear, is find, which basically does the sort of reverse operation. You give it an artifact ID and then a root directory to look underneath, and it just goes and finds whatever file appears to match that ID. So if I do find, and then there we go. Yeah, so it tells me that it's this main.rs, and same deal as the other one. You can do a short flag and just get the file name.
Fantastic. Do we know what it looks like if we have more than one match down the directory tree? I presume it's just another line for each case.
I actually haven't tested that. That's a good question. Let me just copy that file and see what happens.
Real-time testing. Here we go.
Oh, wait, not
I
move.
love it. I absolutely love it.
Gotta copy, not move. All right, let's do it again. Okay, so it only reports one of the things that it finds. So that is a good bug report.
It looks like it probably reports the last one.
Yep.
Looks like. So interesting. Okay, I will open a bug for that and say, hey, we should report every match. So thank you. Live testing. This is good.
Yeah. No, the reason it occurred to me is that I have this pathological tendency to test on license files.
Okay.
Interesting.
And they're everywhere.
Yeah.
So many of my tests end up being against the Apache license file, which, as you might imagine, is a popular one. That is everywhere. And so every as a result, I end up with heavy amounts of testing for repetitive files when I'm playing with stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
It might also still be the first one, because we're assuming that there's an order of the directories that command or system call to give us this permission is giving back.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I'm relying on a async directory walking crate that handles that portion of it. So I don't know its rules for how it enumerates directories. I just sort of take what it gives me.
I do like async directory walking though.
Yeah, actually, that I will say, the Rust async stuff is pretty nice. Actually writing a lot of this was really pretty fast. If I go to, I think it's under FS.
Well, I mean, given the fact that the IO is going to be always the bottleneck when you're directory walking, doing it async is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, and I mean, this is basically what it looks like. I construct a new directory walker on the path that's given, and then I just loop. And for each, I wait on each next entry. If there's nothing, I stop. If there's an error, I print the error. Printing is also async, so I'm actually sending. It's running in a separate task, and so I send the printer message to the task and then await it, and then check, hey, if this is a directory, just skip it because I'm not going to ID directories, and then open the file and produce the ID. This is all just async.
Yeah, something that's a bit interesting that affects async quite a lot is if you look at most imperative languages, the memory management is a it's basically a amorphous large graph, the things pointing at any other things throughout the whole system. But if you look at Rust, similar to most functional languages that have pure functions, everything gets set up as a tree with a clear owner. So because that same memory management is mapped into Rust, where everything has a clear owner from top to bottom, it makes async cases a lot easier.
Yeah, it does. So yeah, that's the little demo, and I will, when the call's done, I can open an issue for the duplicate file, like missing that. So all right, let's see.
So
Switch
Andrew,
my sharing back.
Can I ask one favor?
Oh, sure. What's up?
Can you give the same, do you have any jar files on your machine?
I don't think so. This is just like a code space. So pretty much all it has is the repo.
Never mind then. I was going to say, hey, could you like do the curl of the omnibor ID of a jar file?
Oh yeah,
to
if
see-
I could set that up, but it would take me a little minute.
Yeah, okay, never mind. I'll do it next call.
Awesome.
So I have I really need to present here, but I have a format OmniTrail that was built into the SBOMIT specification that I believe is now part of OpenSSF. So I would love to see whether it would make sense to follow the same pattern here and see if it would make sense to put OmniTrail support into it as well. So it's not a thought that had occurred to me before to stick it into this particular tool. But maybe it makes sense. If it may make sense as a separate tool as well, because it does do things that are slightly beyond the scope of OmniBOR as well. So things for me to think about as well. But I would like to make sure that that gets shown off so people here can see what's going on there.
Yeah. This also makes me think that as we build tools, it would be good if we recorded and shared demos that could be just like shown on the site or linked on we've got the YouTube channel. So like in theory, there are places where demos can go, even if they're pretty brief little, hey, we built a thing, here's how to use it.
I'm a huge fan of that, and also having a place to link to them from the site. Yeah, that's all goodness.
Yeah, because what I'm basically doing there is treating the directory as an artifact that has a dependencies, where the dependencies happen to be the gitoids of all of the files that are underneath of it. That ends up in the manifest file, and then that becomes a gitoid. There's a second file that describes the metadata, because the metadata is important too. That you could say like, these were what the permissions were. This is who the owners were. Things that should not affect the content, but it's still important metadata when you're looking at it from a CI/CD build system. So that's what I was thinking. There's a lot of similarities here, and this thing here could easily help with as something that could help build into that tool. So I can see a lot of usefulness there.
Yeah, awesome.
So this triggers another thought in my mind, which is if we have what tools does it work with in the OmniBOR community? What tools does it work like as just a thing that we put in all of our README files? That gets us to start thinking about consistency across tooling and also making sure that the tools play well with each other, which is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Frederick, what you were suggesting in your comments. Am I correct in that understanding?
Yeah, that's the more generalized version of that, because I think when you visit the OmniBOR website, you see the spec, you get a sense as to what it's about, you get some of the talks, but we want to give the sense of a community, because if people look at it and they say, oh, there's no community here, then what is enticing them to come and contribute? But because people want for their work to have a high impact. And it's a really difficult thing to get people to contribute when they don't there could be a huge community there, but if they don't see it, then it's hard to convince people to join in.
I think we maybe lost Ed.
Really? Oh no.
Yeah, looks like he's
No,
dropped
he's not
off.
here. Yeah.
Must be using Wayland for his window manager as well. Not that I'm bitter
I'll show
or anything.
you.
So, okay.
Sorry, please continue.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I think we're ready to keep going on the agenda, but yeah, if there's anything more to say here. Okay, cool. CFP tracking. So, man, I really make it to do for myself to actually go through enough this table because it's pretty badly out of date. Yeah, so I think which one of these, I guess the question here is kind of thinking more concretely about priority or things to still propose to. RustConf 2024, I do think could be an interesting one if we can get more Rust work done. And I think actually like it would be cool if it's something related to, because I think that we've had a lot of interest talking with, or at least I've talked quite a bit with Ashley Williams at Axo, and they're building out these tools for basically making it easier to package up and distribute binaries. And a lot of their stuff that they do is written in Rust. Ashley was formerly a Rust core team member. And they're pretty interested in using the OmniBOR crate, and been talking with them about that. I think there's a potential avenue for there that work that could then be the basis of sort of applications of OmniBOR to Rust. So I think this would sort of be on my plate to figure out. They're usually, I should say here, no date yet, usually late August, early September. So that's sort of the time frame we're looking at. Weird formatting. Anything else in here? I don't think reproducible builds 2024 has been announced yet. I can gray out some of these. FOSDEM happened already. Snakes. KubeCon. Right, yeah, so November 12th to 15th in Salt Lake City. And have they opened up for proposals?
Check. Think so, but let me double check. Or, yeah, they usually open up like the week of or before KubeCon EU for NA. So let me see. Nah, doesn't look like it's up yet.
So at least at the moment, I'm not seeing a CFP posted yet.
Will open in summer 2024. I'm assuming in the next couple of weeks they'll open up the CFP. If they haven't, I don't see anything on here that says they have. TBD.
CFP deadline TBD.
I think the CFP for Linux Security Summit is passed. So I don't know if you want to gray that one out too.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it looks like, and this one already happened. Oh. Are there other conferences we want to look for? I guess one, yeah, so Packaging Con I already had on here, but nothing's been announced yet. I should put the link here though, because annoyingly, as I discovered previously, there's also a Packaging Con for like physical packaging.
Oh,
So there's one for software packaging, but the one that seems to come up more in searching is for like physical boxes and packaging, which is an annoying collision. So I probably should put an actual link in here.
So are they name squatting or are we?
I do think the other one has been around for longer.
Okay.
probably.
And I don't know if this one will happen again. I think last year was the first year of it. And I don't, I didn't go. I don't know if it's like a thing that they're intending to have be annual, but I want to keep an eye out because I think it's a pretty relevant topic area if it is happening again. So, okay, so I think we have a few to keep an eye out for, but at the moment, nothing more to say here. And then outreach stuff. It does seem like we're at the moment more in kind of a build and prepare stage rather than engaging in outreach. Now we've been talking about putting together more materials, and I think we're, making good progress. David, I think your stuff is for sort of proving out the usefulness of it is really good for preparing for outreach. So I don't know if there's anything more to say here at the moment.
I think the thing about outreach is we still need the document that describes what we're going to ask for.
Yeah. So perhaps then good to can go. We've sort of done the POC demos and implemented discussion. Yeah, I never did this, but there are a number of issues, and I'm pretty happy to talk through stuff if people want to contribute to the Rust implementation. At the moment, the artifact ID stuff is done, so it's more about before moving on to the manifests, I've been sort of polishing the tooling, trying to get like CI/CD stuff set up, documentation and other things kind of around it so that it's at least in usable state with what's there so far. I also still need to move over the FFI that was previously attached to the Gitoid crate and use it, like implement it for the OmniBOR crates that you can use the artifact ID stuff from the OmniBOR crate from other languages. And that should be mostly mechanical. It's pretty similar. So yeah, I have some to-dos here. Okay, so go ahead.
One other thing, apologies, my internet went down for a moment. There was one other thing we probably moved past it, but one suggestion I was going to make, considering, and it may or may not be within the locus of what you're interested in doing, is having a flag that could recurse, including recursing down through various kinds of archives.
Okay.
That could be potentially quite interesting, because, I don't think you necessarily want that all the time, but something that could basically walk down through, various common archive types, and, even things like jar files are really just zip files. So, it doesn't take a whole lot of doing to figure out. I'm sure that there are good libraries for all of that. That might prove interesting, particularly if you could sort of recurse through things all the way down. But again, it may or may not be within the locus of what you're interested in doing in this particular tool.
Yeah, no, and I think that should be pretty easy to do. I know of some existing Rust projects that like handle doing this already. There's a recent thing from Meta tool called /, which is implemented in Rust and handles doing some of this, like, automatic sort of decompression and like untarring and other things, like to search through those sorts of formats. So I could probably take a look at what they're doing.
Cool.
Actually, Andrew, let's collaborate on that on Slack, because I think being able to talk about containers and things contained becomes an important discussion, and whether that container is a jar file, a WAR file, a tar, a zip, a Docker image layer, or some other file system layer. Yeah, there are a lot of containers that we have floating around, and I'd really love to have maybe I'm using the word standard a little bit too strongly here, but a common way of traversing and understanding what those things are. So when I'm doing my JVM implementations, they will emit the same Gitoids as the Rust implementations.
Yeah.
And this, I think, also gets into the Merkle tree discussion that we were having on the Slack channel, which is, okay, you've got a container that contains something. The container itself has a Gitoid, but what's the Merkle tree of what's contained?
Yeah. Okay. So
And
we should
how do,
definitely
yeah.
discuss.
Anyway, I'm sorry for hijacking you. That's what happens when you don't mute me. But
No, that's good. It's good. This is good stuff. One thing I will say, so, and I think this connects to both the outreach materials and then also below the working draft for the use case document, which I made a little bit of progress on, but I will say I've taken a lot more notes on and preparing to write stuff. So not a ton that's newly written in the use case document, but have been making a bunch of notes on sort of thinking through some of the use cases in greater detail. Tangentially to that, and I had a little bit about this in the Slack channel, spent some time thinking about sort of what does it mean for OmniBOR if the hash algorithm that we use breaks, and basically that varies depending on what type of breaking you have. So I have some notes that I intend to write up, and I sort of previewed a little bit to David, but basically you have sort of 3 different ways that or sort of levels of breakage you could have in a hash algorithm, and they all sort of result in the same thing, which is that you can basically poison the sort of OmniBOR data by having nodes that aren't actually equal be treated as equal, and then sort of false edges between things. But sort of the difficulty and ability to target that attack changes depending on sort of how broken a hash algorithm is. So that was kind of a fun tangential thing as I was working on the use case doc.
so I actually think there might, one of the reasons that Gitoids versus just raw hashes, I think there's a little bit of a safety valve in Gitoids because it requires knowing what the length of the thing being hashed is.
Mhm.
So in order to do a collision, if you know what the length of the thing that generated the Gitoid was, in order to do a collision, you're going to have to generate something that collides with exactly the same length.
Yeah, this is part of why, and I don't usually have this fight. I actually don't think shattered is that germane to Git, because the belts
It agrees.
are such. Well, the belts and suspenders are such that I don't think you could actually construct an interesting and meaningful shattered attack on Git. Now, proving that is a lot of work, and so I don't usually go into that particular battle. But it's way harder to do to Git than to do to a generic SHA-1 thing.
Yeah.
Although
my understanding was you also had to have, and I could be wrong with this, but you also had to have control over the prefix. And yeah, when you're doing a Gitoid, you do not have control over the prefix.
So I think, but it does suggest that we might want to carry the length of the file that that generated the Gitoid around in the URL, in the Gitoid URL itself.
Right, because at the moment it's used to produce the hash, but then it's lost and not part of the data that's distributed.
Right. So it might be a topic for discussion for security purposes, which is, okay, if we're going to carry the Gitoid, we also carry the length. And if we're going to carry the length, that becomes the belt and suspenders for the security stuff, because we don't have what Git has, which is the files themselves.
Mm-hmm.
We're just carrying, anyway,
yeah, no, it becomes an additional thing of saying, if you wanted to engineer a collision today, in theory, the length could be different because all that matters is that the final hash is the same. So you can sort of have some wiggle room with the length because we don't actually persist or retain that information in the ID that's produced. But if it is there, then now you have an additional constraint of, okay, you have to collide the hash and have the same length in bytes, which, in theory is more difficult.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other thing is if you actually go look at Shatter is really impressive as an attack because it is both extremely generalizable and incredibly narrow at the same time. So it uses a peculiarity of PDF files and the way they handle comments to allow you to play the game they play. And that peculiarity is actually not present in almost any other file format you look at, right? So you couldn't go and take the trick they pulled PDFs and apply it to C or Rust or JavaScript or any of those languages, it simply
Yeah.
wouldn't work.
Yeah.
You'd have to do something quite different.
Right. And this, I mean, the peculiarities of Shattered and sort of Git's view of like it is not a particularly meaningful attack for them is part of why they were, I think, comfortable with transitioning to SHA-1 DC for sort of defensiveness, but still calling it SHA-1 and sort of acting like as if they're still using SHA-1, which even though they've technically introduced a separate hash algorithm that is almost identical, except when they think collisions are happening.
I would be really shocked to see it in the wild, actually differ from SHA-1 in the wild.
And that's, yeah. But I will say this, and this gets into a little bit of philosophical stuff, and I'll sort of argue my perspective here, which is that it is still a separate hash algorithm, and that's why, like, in the current Gitoid crate, we do, like, or I should say I, because I wrote it, I do distinguish between SHA-1 and SHA-1 DC, and that gets surfaced in the Gitoid that's produced, which actually is an incompatibility with Git.
Have you come across a spec anywhere for SHA-1 DC? Because all I've ever seen is go look at the code.
Yeah, that's all I've ever seen as well. And there's a Rust implementation of SHA-1 DC, and that's just what I use. I'm pretty sure that it just links to the C implementation of SHA-1 DC. Like, I think it's just a Rust wrapper for it.
So a quick thing though is, regardless as to whether or not it's technically sound, there's also the perception that people tend to have around SHA-1, where like it could be that Gitoid is not attackable in that way, but the fact that people have lost trust in SHA-1 is something that we should be careful with.
Right. Well, and this gets to, so we've had some prior discussions. Well, actually, I should say, first of all, before I say that, the README for the Gitoid crate does specifically document the two pieces of current Git incompatibility. One of them is that our in-memory representation is different and actually smaller than the one that Git uses. And then the other is specifically this SHA-1 CD is what it says here, but CD, DC, it's called different things, different places. Basically, that we are more careful about distinguishing it than the Git project is. So it is at least documented, which I wanted to make sure I did. But then the other thing is, so we'd had prior discussions about whether it made sense to reduce down to one hash algorithm, and if that should be basically SHA-1 DC or SHA-256. And Ed, I think unfortunately this happened in a series of meetings where it happened after you left because it was later in the meeting notes. Nothing is committed in the spec, and I raised this with Ava last week. They also wanted to go and take a look at it. So there's nothing that's officially updated in the spec. There are a bunch of notes here, and the basic, I think some of the key arguments, one of them basically was that in general, people tend not to trust SHA-1, regardless of the technical sort of specific reasons for why the Shattered attack may not matter to us in practice. Socially, I think there's, as Frederick was saying, that there's less of a sort of support for SHA-1. And then also that sort of, how do I say this? Okay, I put it this way. David, you said it was like a terabyte to store all of these hashes, and I think that you were just doing SHA-256.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's kind of with each additional hash, it's, you're doubling it, or if you have three, because if you distinguish SHA-1, SHA-1 DC, and SHA-256, it's three. Just storage and operational complexity kind of goes up.
I'll go back and look through the notes on that to try and wrap my head around it. I will go back and wrap my head around to try and wrap my head around it, because the other thing that occurs to me is that there is a distinction between sort of the indexing operation versus what we would like the build tools to output, because there is a huge advantage in being able to tie back to the source code file. If you're just indexing things, that advantage is not nearly as great. But if you're building things, it's enormous.
One thing on measuring the performance as well is it's very easy to conflate the cost of hashing with the cost of pulling the data from a POSIX file system. And back when I was doing the Go implementation, I ran an experiment where I hashed like using SHA-1 only, and then I tried SHA-256 only, and then I tried SHA-1 and SHA-256, but from the same, after pulling the same POSIX, just a single read call to test against both of them. And when I tested it against the kernel across the whole source code, there was almost no meaningful difference between any of the three runs, which signifies that most of the weighting was actually in IO rather than CPU. So do be careful when you're measuring that you're that the cost of the IO is not blowing out the cost of the computation of the hash.
I mean, from a computation of a hash point of view, I would expect the block hit for the IO to swamp everything. You know, basically doing one SHA, doing both SHAs, you know, doing every SHA you can imagine is effectively free compared to the cost of pulling the damn file in.
Yeah.
And
Encrypting the file, decrypting the file, salting the file, and encrypting it in circles 3 times, all free compared to the cost of pulling the file in.
well, that's doubly true on the most recent CPUs, which have instructions that do a lot of this work automatically. So, you know, or I shouldn't say automatically, but you have the vector instructions, and the stuff that compiles well down into the vector instructions winds up making this quite literally the only cost is the memory moves.
Yeah,
So,
which is
you know,
pretty much every CPU that has AVX instructions, or maybe it's AVX2, but that's pretty much every modern CPU that's been sold and probably in the past 10 years.
No, 8, maybe, but close.
well, and anyway, at least what I've observed is the cost of computing, you know, the cost of building the index is almost entirely IO.
Yeah, which makes
And
sense.
yeah, and especially because I'm running on a box with, you know, 24 terabytes of spinning media because it's cheaper. You know, the IO cost is everything. And being able to not do random IO is also everything on spinning media.
Yep.
Now, granted, I'm being cheap. I built this whole thing on a box. It's costing me less than $100 a month. But you know, I think that as we're looking at this, we should be looking at how do we make sure that it's as efficient as possible? Because if we add kind of constraints like spinning media and that sort of stuff up front, it means that we're not going to be making choices that wind up costing more later.
Yeah, no, and like I said, I do want to go back and review. There appear to be excellent notes here, and I don't want to just go off random commentary with something that people have discussed a lot without reviewing that discussion. So I'll come back around on that.
Awesome. Yeah, and definitely, I mean, our goal is because this is a pretty central kind of decision, you know, it's part of why I wanted to make sure I was taking pretty thorough notes, and that there was a lot of discussion before anything got merged in terms of any changes to the spec.
I've never noticed you not taking thorough notes, Andrew, so I just don't believe you.
I'm gonna just forget stuff. Like it's purely it is self-preservation because I'm gonna forget everything.
Yeah, I'm much the same way. It's the same reason I write documentation. I don't write documentation for you. I write documentation because I will forget everything.
So I'm going to throw out one other thing, which is NIST has a list of SHAs of common files in file systems. I'm sorry, in operating systems. And it's effectively we know these files, there's no point in looking at them because we already know that they're fine. I think NIST is using either MD5 or SHA-1. And if we want to do some compatibility, we might also think about that. And I'm now contradicting what I've been saying all along, which is Gitoid and SHA-256. But, you know, it'd be really helpful to be able to have something where you have an index that's also unified with stuff that NIST is doing. Because, you know, it's like, how are we going to play in the broader ecosystems?
It would probably also be useful to understand like what NIST foregoing plans there are, because if we're talking about MD5 and SHA-1, that shrieks to my brain unmaintained.
The MD5, yeah.
So
I mean, a lot of the stuff is shared with law enforcement. So when law enforcement is inspecting a particular device, they can look at the files that are actually not known versus all of the files. It helps, you know, it reduces the search problem for law enforcement.
I do apologize.
So-
We're at the top of the hour. I do have to drop.
Ooh, yeah, same.
Yeah.
But thanks, this is a good discussion. And I have bugs to fix.
But just remember, MD5 is probably not FIPS compliant, but other than that, I'll catch you all later.
Yeah.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye, everybody.